Okay, so I want to talk a little more about types of threats to internal validity. In this case, I want to talk about threats that are related to time. So these are what are often called time-related threats to internal validity. So this is going to happen these are going to be an issue in studies where rather than comparing two different groups, we're comparing the same group at two different times. So we take a group of people, we measure them at time 1 on some kind of dependent variable, and we measure them at time 2 on that same variable to see if there's been a change. In between there, we give them some kind of treatment, or actually in this case, I'm going to say training. We give them some kind of training in between. So what this is going to be, let's say that this is some kind of test. And so the dependent variable is their score on this test. And we're going to give them some kind of training to hopefully increase their score on this test. Maybe it's an intelligence test, whatever the test is. We are hoping that this training is going to help them do better. So what we want to see in terms of results is that at time 1, maybe they don't do so well on the test. They get a relatively low score, but then at time 2, we have substantially increased their score. At least, well, I should say their score is higher. We hope that this is higher because we have caused it to be higher, that this training actually caused this difference that we are seeing. But again, there's this question of, are there other things that could have caused that difference? And in this case, what we're going to talk about is other things that could have happened over time, changes that could have happened over time that might account for that difference. And we have a number of different changes that can happen over time. But these fall into a few general categories. So we can have changes that happen over time, changes that happen in the environment. And by environment, I just mean anything that is going on around the participant rather than something that is happening internally within the participant's body or mind. We'll talk about that in a second. But anything that's happening in the environment. So, for example, we might have, unbeknownst to us as the researchers, maybe this study is being done with students, and as the example they give in your textbook is maybe there's a fire alarm. There's a fire alarm that goes off in the middle of the night in the dormitories, and so the students end up standing outside for a long time, and they don't get very good sleep. They come in the next day for this time 1, and they're very tired because of that change in their environment, and so they don't do so well on the test. Then they go and they get a good night's rest. They come back for time 2, and they do better. So because of that change in their environment that was something other than our training, that is a potential explanation for the difference in test scores, and so that's a threat to internal validity. And any kind of time-related change in the environment, the term that they use for that, they call that history. I think this is maybe not the best term, but that is the term they use. So anything that's going on in the environment. If it's happening in the participant themselves, we have a different term for that. So that's another possibility, is we can have changes over time that happen in the participant. So our participants can experience changes in their physiology or in their psychology, and that we call, again, I'm not sure this is the best term, but we call it maturation. Sometimes it literally is maturation. Over time, for example, maybe we're doing this test with young children, and over time, the children, I'll put it up here, the children get older. In the middle of the study, the children are aging. They're growing and aging. Their brains are developing. So if this was a long study, maybe a longitudinal study that we did over many years, between our times that we tested these children, their brains may have developed substantially, and they, of course, may do much better on the second test simply from brain development. So that is an example of maturation, and it also is a change that's happening that's other than the training, other than the treatment we're giving. And so it is provides an alternative explanation and is thus another threat to the internal validity of our study. Another place in our study where we might see changes over time is not in the environment or in the participants, but in the measuring devices themselves. Whatever means we're using, whatever instruments we're using to measure these things, we could see changes in those measuring devices. And this is what they call this instrumentation, referring to the instruments that we're using to measure the things in our study. So instrumentation threat, or I think a better term for this, you'll sometimes see this called instrumental decay. The idea that there's a decay or deterioration or a miscalibration that happens in our measuring devices over time. Some kind of change that happens in them. So a really straightforward example of this would be if we were doing some kind of weight loss intervention. We're trying to help people lose weight. And we measure them at time 1 and they're heavy, and we measure them at time 2 and they're less heavy. We think our intervention has caused that difference. But what if the scale that we're weighing them on, maybe the batteries are starting to run low or the calibration has gone off, and it is just measuring all of the people in the study as being, that is reporting that they're a bit lighter than they actually were, or than it was reporting at time 1. So our instrument has decayed. So we have this instrumental decay that is causing a change that could explain the results we're seeing. It's an alternative explanation, so it's a threat to internal validity.